Hi everyone, it's Lindsay. Welcome back to another video. Today I want to share with you some Zentangle backgrounds that I made. They're very easy to make. All you need are some stamps. So let's go ahead and get started. The stamps I'm using today are from Cracker Box and Susie Stamps. Everything I'm using, all the supplies I'll be using is going to be listed and linked down in the description box below so you can easily find what I'm using. Now, the main thing that you want to think about when you think about stamps for these backgrounds are you want them to be line stamps. Think about Zentangle when you look at it. It's very thin lines. Maybe some thicker lines in the middle, but for the most part, you've got some thin lines that look like line drawings. So those kinds of stamps. For my stamps today, I'm going to actually be using them on acrylic blocks, and I would suggest using a stamp positioner. Now, to get my stamps to stick to my acrylic block well, I am putting a little bit of adhesive on them. You can skip that part. I don't want mine to move. I want mine to stay put. So each and every time I use my stamp positioner, it's going to be correct. For my stamp positioner, since I'm using rubber stamps, I am using a Stamp-A-Majig. This is an older style of stamp positioner, but I still love it. It works amazing with your rubber stamps. What you do is you have your little Stamp-A-Majig piece, and then you have your clear sheet. On your stamp positioner, your blue part, there is a right angle. Tuck that clear sheet into that right angle. If you've lost your clear sheet, a piece of acetate will work as well. I like to take my stamping ink, go ahead and prep my stamp, and then put your acrylic block right into that right angle, smush it right up against there, and stamp down onto your clear sheet. I like to use the rough side so everything stays put, and that way the clear side can kind of go up against the backing, can go up against the cardstock and slide around very easily. For my first background, I'm going to be using the Clematis Doodle stamp from Cracker Box and Susie Stamps, and I'm using the Midnight ink from Catherine Pooler. Whenever you're stamping your backgrounds, think about how you're going to color them. Use an ink that will play nicely with your coloring. There's nothing worse than doing your background and thinking, oh man, I used the wrong black ink. I've done it too many times to count, so just think about what your coloring medium is that you're using. So I stamp my first stamp, then I'll go ahead and take my clear sheet and line up the stamp exactly how I want it to look and where I want it to fit. I'll place down my Stamp-A-Majig blue handle up against that right angle, the corner. Now here's where you kind of need to think about this particular stamp. For this one, I went ahead and stamped it down after I lined it up. Now, think about an acrylic block. It has 4 corners. Each one of those 4 corners can sit nicely into that Stamp-A-Majig. But not every time you put that corner is it going to line up how you stamped it on your sheet. So what I did was I actually marked the corner with a little Sharpie that goes in the corner of the Stamp-A-Majig. That way, every time I line up my clear sheet, get my positioner ready, I know what corner of my acrylic block I need to put into my stamp positioner so my stamp will line up how it's stamped on the sheet. I messed up whenever I first started this and it wasn't lining up, and then I would have to twist my acrylic block and try to figure it out. Just put that little dot there when you start stamping, and that's going to help you line this up each and every time. So I stamped 3 of those little doodles connecting the 2 little leaves on each side across the center of the card. Then I'm going to move down a row and I'm going to connect the 3 leaves. It's much easier to see as I'm doing it on video than to explain it. But I'm just lining up my clear sheet, how I want my stamp to look, where I want all of my leaves to touch, positioning my blue handle, making sure that it's nice and tight and lined up and everything's positioned just perfectly. Then I can go ahead and remove my clear sheet, ink up my stamp. I've got my little mark there to know which corner of my acrylic block needs to fit into my stamp positioner. So I'll go ahead and get that corner in there, and then I can stamp directly down, and it's going to line up like a dream. Now this is my favorite stamp positioner to use with my red rubber stamps. I love my Misty, however, it is not great for this particular background. So I like to use this. Now there are different stamp positioners out there that are very similar to this. There's one from, I believe, Apple Pie maybe is what it's called. I don't know. There are a few different stamp positioners like this, but you could also make your own with any right angle and a clear sheet. I've seen people do it. There are videos of it online, so you could easily make your own as well. I'm going to continue stamping out my background, making sure to line up all 3 little leaves and just continue to stamp my rows and create this background. Now the great thing about using a stamp positioner is if you mess up stamping the first time, you can still go back and stamp it the second time. So you'll see once I have this little ink removed, I did leave this part in there so you could see we all messed up. I messed up here. What I actually did was just let the ink dry for just a minute so I didn't smear it around at all. Then I used my sand eraser. If that's not going to get it off, then I bring in my craft knife and scratch away at the surface until the ink is gone. Then I take my sanding eraser and kind of buff it back out, make sure it's nice and smooth until the ink is completely gone. You can also bring a white gel pen over if you have a really stubborn spot. So once I had that removed, it's time to stamp my little flower finally on to finish off that second row there. I lined up my stamp positioner and I'm going to stamp it down. Now this time, it didn't stamp completely solid, so what I did was I just inked it up very quickly, continued to press it down again right in my stamp positioner, and it will line up like a dream. It is a little bit darker because I did that double stamping, but once this entire background's complete, you'll never know. It's going to be so busy, but it's so beautiful. I'll continue to stamp this background. I went down first, and then I'm going to go ahead and continue on the upper part of this panel. There are a ton of different ways you can line up this stamp. I happen to be doing it this way, but you could easily line these up where each leaf is one on top of the other. So instead of going kind of in the middle of each one, when you go up a row and you go in the center of 2 underneath it, you could go directly on top of each one, and that would make a gorgeous background as well. A lot of different ways you could make this your own look. There's a closer look at the background all complete, and now let's go ahead and move on to the next background. So for my second background, I'm using a different stamp. This is the Flower Doodle stamp. You see a trend here. These are all doodling type of stamps. Again, I'm going to put it right onto my acrylic block. This already has the adhesive on it. That way it's going to stay put. It's not going to fall off at all, and it's going to be in the same position every time. It's not going to shift around on me. I have my little dot in the top corner there, and I'm going to get my stamp positioner ready. I've got my handle and my clear sheet tucked in, and then I'll go ahead and place my little dot right in that right corner and stamp directly down. Again, using Midnight ink from Catherine Pooler, and I am stamping on the rough side of this sheet. I find when I do that, the ink stays put better. I have a less chance of smearing it as well. So once that was done, it's time to start stamping my background. Now I played around with the placement of this one a lot. I think I restarted this maybe 4 times before I was happy with my placement of this particular stamp. So for this, I went ahead and the first one, my first background, I just stamped my stamp right in the center. I didn't position it my first one. This one, I did want to go ahead and position my stamp, make sure it was just right, and then I will stamp it down using that Stamp-A-Majig. For this, I wanted 1 flower petal on the top and 2 on the bottom. That way I could go one on top of the other and connect 2 flower petals to the one on top, kind of inlay them into each other so they line up very well. I'll go ahead and ink up my stamp again once I have my positioner ready, and I'll stamp it down. Now this one, once you get going, it's super easy to get it done. You do want to remember to finish off your edges. This does get a little tricky when you're doing very, very little stamping. What I like to do is put a little bit of removable adhesive on the back and tape it down to my work surface. That way my cardstock isn't going to shift. I can bump it, it's not going to move, and everything's going to line up really, really nicely. Once I finish the top of the row, I'll go ahead and move down to the bottom, and I'll line up the top, just one little flower petal, to the bottom to position my stamp positioner, move my clear acrylic sheet out of the way, and go ahead and stamp down my little flower. Now, these would take ages to hand draw. However, I made these two backgrounds in less than 30 minutes with these stamps. And you can use any line drawing stamps you have. Just get creative with it. You can stamp them in different ways too and make different looks, different backgrounds. You can mix a few of them up, maybe use these two together, create tons of different backgrounds. The options on this are endless. Now once I moved on to the right side, I'm going to go ahead and line up to where all the little leaves are connecting. And then again, I'll just continue to move up and down the cardstock until I have this filled up with all the flowers. I did want to keep all the stamping in this video though, so you could see these backgrounds come together. I think it is so neat that just by taking this one stamp, connecting it to each other, you're creating this really fun hand-drawn look, but it's so easy to do. I'll go ahead and continue stamping up the left side now. And again, I'm just going to go ahead and position that. Take my time positioning because once you get so far into these, you really don't want to mess them up. But I'll position my little clear sheet. Once I have that, I'll go ahead and put down my blue handle, make sure it's nice and tight, remove that clear sheet, and then stamp down, making sure I have my little dot in the right corner there. There is a closer look at my second background all done. And now I took these off camera to color. I figured the coloring wasn't as important as the stamping, so I wanted to keep all the stamping in and cut out the coloring. For my first card panel, I used both of them actually. I used memento markers. For this one, I used Rosebud, Tangelo, Pear Tart, Bahama Blue, Dandelion, and Tuxedo Black. I just colored these in very quickly. You don't have to use markers. You could use Copics, watercolors, whatever you want. I just love the look of these very bright markers. Now for my second panel, I actually did a little cutting on it already. And for my memento markers, I only colored in two of the little strips that I cut. I used Elderberry, Nautical Blue, Olive Grove, Cantaloupe, and Gray Flannel. Now both of these backgrounds are so much fun. However, I find that I do a lot of stamp backgrounds, so I need to find new and creative ways to use them. What I like to do a lot is cut them up. So that's what I'm doing today. I cut this particular panel that I made into 5 different sections, just with my paper trimmer. The two sections, the smallest sections from the center, I'm going every other here, I colored in with my memento markers. Now I'm going to put them down directly onto my card base. This is an A2 side folding card base that I'm using horizontally. This is super simple to put these down and line them up. You just need to put in those pieces temporarily and then you can glue them down and they'll be perfectly aligned. Now for my final 3 pieces, I'm actually going to add little mats onto them. This is very easy to do. All I did was cut cardstock strips. In this case, I'm using black cardstock strips to help them stand out. I added a little bit of adhesive along the edges that will be on the inside of the card, not any of the outside edges, just the inside portions that I cut. Then I will go ahead and add those very, very thin strips of cardstock. I don't mind the overhang right now because I find it easier to take my trimmers and trim them once I get them attached to the panels. This way, I don't have to do any measuring and everything's going to look perfect when I'm done. So I just take my long blade scissors and cut them off very, very quickly so they're nice and flush. Then I added foam tape to the back of each one of those pieces, made sure I had them in the right spots before I put them down, so I laid them all out, and then I'll go ahead and start gluing them down. I just take the release paper off the back of the foam tape and then place them down in the spots. This is not only going to give these different looks, so you have some colored panels in there, you have some black and white panels, you've got those mats to add some definition, but now you've also got that definition, which makes this background even more fun. I just love the way this one turned out, and it was as simple as cutting up the background, just taking it to my paper trimmer and slicing it up. For my sentiment, I forgot about it, to be quite honest. I thought more about my backgrounds on these cards than I did on the sentiments. So what I decided to do was take a Thinking of You sentiment from Cracker Box and Susie Stamps, and I stamped it right down onto a black cardstock strip, and I stamped that down with some Versamark ink. I'm going to go ahead and heat emboss this with white, so I've got a nice black and white, very nice contrasting sentiment ready to go on my card. I heat set that very quickly. I added some adhesive to the back of that, and then I'll go ahead and place that down right in the center of the card at an angle. So this is just going to fit right in with all those different cuts I have going on that background. Now once I had that placed down, I just used my scissors very quickly to go ahead and cut that flush with the card itself. Again, I find it easier to go this route and just cut it down once I've got it attached with my scissors than to try and measure and cut with my paper trimmer beforehand. So much easier to do it this way. I left this as is, no embellishment needed. Super duper simple to do once you get that background done. All it took was some stamping, some coloring, and some cutting. Now, my final card, my second background. This one is my favorite. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with it, so I just, again, took it to my paper trimmer and started cutting on it. There's no measurements here. There's no rhyme or reason. I just started cutting where I thought it looked the best. So I cut the top off, then I put it in my paper trimmer, and I just move it around until I'm happy with the look of it. Then I just go ahead and give it a good cut. Now for this, I really wanted those to show up, but I didn't know how to do that without adding mats behind it. So what I decided to do was actually take each one of those pieces and where it's going to meet the other piece, not anything from the outside of the actual panels itself, but just the inside where it's going to meet those other pieces that I've cut. I'm going to cut just a sliver of that off. This is going to create a little gap in between each one of those pieces. It's still going to show up as one big background, but adding that little bit of a gap in between each panel just allows for more interest on the background. This is another trick that you can do. Just cut little bits of it off. Allow that background to peek through. You could even stencil or ink blend on the background and add more interest, and that would peek through those gaps. You can take this as far as you want, or you can keep it nice and simple with a white background like I did. To add a little bit more interest, I did pop each one of these panels up. I'm using foam tape on the back. Again, if you want simple interest, just add dimension. That's what I like to do on a lot of my cards. So I added quite a bit of foam tape to the back of these pieces, and I'll just go ahead and position them right onto an A2 top folding white card base. These are super simple to line up because I didn't cut anything off the sides of them where they meet the outside edge of the card base. Really easy to line up. You just line it up with the outside edges of the card base. So I put on the top piece first, then I'll go ahead and put on the bottom piece. The center piece is going to be the most tricky. It's still really easy. You're just going to line up the outside edge and center it in between your top and bottom piece. But just put that top and bottom piece on first so you can go ahead and center that in between the two of them. But again, really easy to do. Then I've got this nice background that has that nice geometric look, but also those cut lines in between for more interest. I finished this one off with a prayer sentiment die. I just found that the easiest route to go on this. You could always add a sentiment strip or a nice little sentiment banner right in the center of this card, and that would be gorgeous as well. Again, no embellishments here. I wanted the backgrounds to be the main focal point. A final look at both cards, and that is going to do it for me today. There are going to be links down below that you can check out in the description box. Also, don't forget to subscribe, and there's going to be another video that you can watch next to keep you going. Happy crafting, everyone!